You know what? There are so many reasons to be excited and optimistic about our future. So many cracks of light in our world right now. People who are out there courageously blazing new trails and leading the way towards a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. I want you to hear their ideas and let them inspire you to see this time we're in as a fascinating time of transformation. Welcome to the Cracks of Light podcast. I am your host, Laura Storm. Throughout this podcast series, we will co-create a leadership manifesto for a thriving world. Please feel free to join us by going to my website, www.laura-storm.com. And now to episode 2 on bringing heart, soul, and nature into the business world. You get to meet the pioneering thought leader on the future of business, Giles Hutchins. Early on, Giles had a very successful career working as a management consultant for KPMG, but he always wondered, how can I apply these learnings to the things that I really care about? And when do I start? One day, something happened that made him change his life drastically. And today, 5 years later, Giles is now one of the world's leading thinkers on the future of business. He has written 3 of the, in my opinion, most important, relevant, and exciting books for leaders of today and the future. And I was both in tears and bursting with excitement reading his words. In this episode, we will cover why he left a successful career to follow the whispers of his heart, what humans and organizations can learn from nature, how organizations can become thriving, resilient, vibrant, and future fit, the role of spiritual intelligence and intuition in the business world, key leadership traits of the future, and much, much more. I promise you'll be inspired, motivated, and excited about the future. Let's start. So Giles, welcome to the Cracks of Light podcast. I have really been looking forward to this conversation that you and I will have. And first, I would like the listeners to know why you left a very successful corporate career working as a sustainability consultant within KPMG. And then you moved on to become the Global Sustainability Director for Atos. But then you decided to do something completely different. And what was that, and why did you make that decision?
Yes, well, the excuse I gave to my bosses at the time while I was resigning from corporate life was that we were due the birth of our first child. But actually, what was going on inside me was that for a number of years I had realized the importance of me being able to open up more to what I truly felt and allow that to come through my work. Over the last few years before my resignation, I had already started exploring about business inspired by nature, what that meant. I started writing articles for The Guardian in 2010, 2011, set up Biomimicry for Creative Innovation. So I was already exploring that through my work. And corporate life really was, even though KPMG, where I was actually a management consultant rather than a sustainability consultant, was a very good employer, and I learned a lot from them. I ran a practice of about 50 consultants for a number of years, and also then at Atos, a big multinational working in global sustainability. I learned a lot, but it's quite a constraining environment. And to really go deeper with the innovations and insights that I wanted to allow to bubble up inside me and come out through my work, I knew I just had to leave and give myself some proper space to breathe and to really connect with my soul.
But what made you make such a courageous decision? Because you had been exposed to the business environment and that way of thinking and operating. What made you suddenly think that your soul was speaking to you? I mean, that's not very often you hear a businessman talk about the language of his soul.
Well, I had some profound experiences through my life. From an early age, I'd have to say, Laura, I've always been deeply in love with nature and always been interested in our relationship with nature, with each other, with life. And I part convinced myself in going into business that I was understanding about the system, about perhaps the strategy that humanity had up its sleeve, quite quickly realizing that perhaps there wasn't that real strategy that had been thought through. And so I was kind of equipping myself about how business really works. Management consultancy was a great way to do that because I saw different aspects of business, many different businesses, non-profit, for-profit, and so forth across the world. So I was getting good learning, but always in the back of my mind, I was like, well, when do I apply this learning to what I really care about? Because I always knew, in my teenage years, for instance, I was exposed to one of the maths teachers at the time in a free lesson, showed us some footage of animal farming, factory farming, and animal testing in laboratories. And it really shocked me. It was like someone putting a javelin in my heart. It really hurt. And I suppose the veneer of civilization slipped for me, and I saw something deeper, which was uncivilized, essentially. And it struck me that all was not perhaps right, and that stayed with me. And so when I was in my business career, I didn't really share much about how I really felt. When I did, it came out in perhaps not a very eloquent way, and often people would kind of look at me with raised eyebrows. So I kind of just got on with being successful in business. But then there was a day in London, or actually a Sunday afternoon in my flat when I was on the outside, very successful, running this, business unit in KPMG at quite a young age. But David Attenborough in one of the nature programs really spoke to me when he said that this richness of diversity and beauty that we've been watching in this nature program is actually under irreparable threat due to, we now know, as a direct result of human activity, and that the time is now to deal with this. To try and rectify this. When he said the time is now, it really spoke to me because I was kind of waiting. I was kind of thinking, well, how long do I wait? How long do I learn? Do I wait until I become CEO of an organization? What do I do? And, he spoke to me, and it felt like, no, now is the time. So I kind of then started trying to change, moving into sustainable business. But then after a number of years in sustainable business, realizing I needed to actually go even deeper into really opening up to what I was sensing, what I perhaps always sensed was a different worldview, what I can describe perhaps as connectedness, a deeper connectedness of all of life that I was sensing but wasn't really allowing to come through because I was so busy. I was running teams in different parts of the world as a global head of sustainability. I had webinars first thing in the morning, 300 or 400 emails a day. It was relentless. So I felt I needed to give myself that space.
And you then decided to leave London and move to the countryside. Yeah,
I was fortunate with the global role that it meant that I could move out of London and went to Devon and loved it. I spent time writing articles next to trees, learning about tree meditations, embracing yoga intensely at that time, every morning and evening. And I was essentially going through, I didn't know it at the time, but I was going through a kind of metamorphosis in a way, a deeper transformation, and more of my perhaps soulful awareness was coming through into my daily awareness. So I was starting to change. A lot of that was coming through in incoherent ways, perhaps. emotional tensions coming up from perhaps things I'd kept suppressed through my life. Maybe the beginnings of a dark night of the soul were occurring for me whilst I was still in corporate life. But then when I left in 2012, we were already sort of deep in nature, and I was already starting to hug trees and sit in nature and meditate and really start to go deeper with what does this all mean for me? How can I articulate the way in which I'm seeing the world, this interbeing, this interconnectedness? And that was what led to me writing my second book, or researching my second book, The Illusion of Separation.
And before that, you had written The Nature of Business. What can business leaders and corporate structures, what can we learn from nature?
Wow, lots of levels. I mean, there's a whole body of work out there at the moment around what we can learn from nature in terms of patterns and principles, and helping with product design and architecture and so forth, and designing processes around biomimicry, around cradle to cradle industrial ecology, closed loop economics, and so forth. There's a lot of going on there that was actually not so well known when I started writing about it back in 2010 and 11. So the nature of business really was trying to articulate, convey the importance of nature in inspiring us as leaders, and recognizing that actually our organizations are living systems that actually can take a lot of inspiration from nature. So what I also did in the nature of business is go beyond traditional biomimicry and industrial ecology, and look into how people, ways of operating, could take learning from nature. So I talked about things like shamanic business, for instance. So when senior people in different parts of businesses, there were some CEOs at the time who read it, they were reading about shamanic business, about how we could actually be more in harmony with nature, and what does that mean, and how can we activate timeless wisdom for today's challenges. So in a way, it was quite pioneering as a book, and I'm still coming across people now. It was published in 2012. Just came across someone on Friday who's coming on a nature immersion that I do with leaders, who just came across the nature of business, and it's just as, I think, perhaps relevant for people today as it was when it was written. So it's nice to see that it's still percolating out there.
Can you explain a bit more about what can business? Why is shamanic and the knowledge of the original people? Why is that relevant for business leaders? I mean, haven't we gotten past that now?
Well, yes, I think there's definitely something to be said about not trying to return to some golden era or some time that's already gone. We certainly have become separate from nature, and technology is such that we can move forward. But I would argue that there is a lot of richness in allowing our connection, our connectedness with nature, because we're part of nature. So our deeper human nature is part of that psychosynthesis, if you like, a deep depth psychology, as well as opening up to nature. And by that, I mean nature at two levels. One you could call the immanence of nature. So recognizing the social and ecological systems that we operate within, and that mind of nature that is there, the interconnectedness, the relationality. So recognizing our business ecosystem, for instance, is actually an ecosystem of relations that all interrelate with society, with the environment, and widening that perceptual horizon in business that we see in for-purpose organizations these days. And that is becoming more and more not just fashionable, but essential for organizations that want to become more resilient, more vibrant, more purposeful in these times of fast-moving change. So at one level, there's that kind of immanence within nature. And the other level is the kind of transcendence of opening up to a deeper mind of nature, which allows us to see beyond separateness, which we've got largely caught up in through neo-Darwinism, through scientific management theory, through patriarchy, ego explosion. Lots of reasons, rationalism and the scientific revolution have accelerated that, to actually going beyond that sense of separateness into reconnecting again with our deeper humanity, with the social systems and ecological systems of life. And that's a psycho-spiritual experience, opening up to what Maslow's hierarchy of needs refers to as self-actualization, and then into self-realization. Carl Jung refers to it. All of the good quality leadership models that we draw upon today, whether it be Frederick Laloux's work in Teal Evolutionary, whether it be Richard Barrett's work in the Values Center, Peter Hawkins' work around coaching, all sorts of models, Bill Torbert's work, spiral dynamics, they all refer to this shift in consciousness, that we go from allowing our ego to kind of dominate us, sense of separation from nature, from who we truly are, to actually opening up, permeating more readily that sense of self with a deeper interconnectedness with life. And with that comes a transformation and becomes an ability for us to call on far more of who we truly are, and therefore bring in much more IQ, EQ, SQ, spiritual intelligence, intuition. And we actually notice now our brainwaves change, and the way that our body coheres, our head, heart, gut, changes our physiology and psychology, and makes us far better leaders, far more able to deal with fast-moving change and to create space in our organizations for those organizations to become more like living, purposeful systems.
I completely agree with your thoughts in all of your 3 books, and a question that kept popping up in my mind while I was reading those, but also during my recovery process of recovering from a brain injury, where I saw myself kind of running into nature again and kind of reconnecting with nature. I had a strong connection with nature in my childhood, just as you've described you have. And this whole experience of reconnecting with nature has been huge for me these past couple of years, and made me very interested into how important nature is to us and how we on all levels can be inspired by nature. Also in terms of how we collaborate with others. And when I was sharing those ideas to 200 management consultants last week, one of them came up to me afterwards and said, "But isn't nature about survival of the fittest?" And you've probably had maybe that kind of comment in your life as well. What is your response to that many people see that the Darwin teachings were all about survival of the fittest?
Yes, I've had that. That's the one that one has quite a lot coming up quite early on as a challenge. It reminds me of when I was actually being interviewed with BBC for a network across the world live, and I was being confronted quite aggressively on that topic. Well, I think here, because I've got a bit more time to respond to it and explore it and unpack it a bit, I would probably go a bit further than what I did on the interview, which was to say, at the interview I said that really it's not just about competition, that actually collaboration is played out at all sorts of levels throughout nature, and that actually the richness of evolution we see on Earth didn't come about through combat. It actually came about through partnerships and networks and reciprocating relationships. And actually, when Darwin talked about being survival of the fittest, he actually talks about fitting into your niche, which is about adapting, sensing and responding and being part of a set of continually participating relationships, which is a very different mindset than warping it into a kind of domination against others. But to unpack it a bit more now and go into it a bit deeper, I would say that, some aspects of neo-Darwinism really are divisive in terms of seeing the whole process of evolution as selfish and innately competitive. What we now know at the forefronts of facilitation ecology, for instance, and the way in which trees, plants share nutrients, and how soil communities and microbes and bacteria and fungi actually work, and how now at the forefronts of quantum physics and neurobiology and cardiology, we're now recognizing how everything is interconnected, not just locally in the immanence of nature, if you like, but non-locally. Our views, I was reading recently someone saying that actually Darwinian views of life are now quite outdated. We're updating, we're upgrading our worldview all the time, and unfortunately, this isn't taught at schools or business schools, and we're still largely caught up in a paradigm that's quite frankly outdated. There's some really useful parts of what we've learnt that need to be taken forward, but they need to be put in context rather than being seen as a dominant view of how life really is, when it's not. It's far richer than that, far richer. And by opening ourselves up to that richness, and also opening ourselves up to how we view consciousness and our sense of place and purpose within this deeply conscious and interrelated world, it actually enriches our humanity. It makes us more human. It doesn't detract or give us another level of complexity to confuse us. It actually opens us up to who we truly are as human beings in this more than human world.
But where did we lose ourselves? Where did we turn our backs against nature and see ourselves as something that is separate to it? And even you could go further than that. How did we disconnect from ourselves? I know this is a very big question, but I'm curious as to what would be your reflections about that.
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote The Illusion of Separation, my second book. I had those thoughts very much in my mind. It was funny because at the time when I left corporate life, I was doing some work with Exeter University Business School at the time. I was teaching on their One Planet MBA, and the Exeter Business School very kindly asked if I wanted to do a PhD in business inspired by nature, essentially what I had been exploring in the first book, The Nature of Business, and that they would pay me and I'd become a visiting professor and so forth. And when I was in the process of leaving corporate life, it seemed like such a wonderful thing for me to get involved in, so I didn't have to step right out into the open ocean. I could go into something else. And during that process, I quite quickly realized that all I was doing was creating another little container for myself, and that I actually needed to just go out deeply and really explore, not take on the PhD, but go deeper. And that was why I wrote The Illusion of Separation. It was almost like a bit of a PhD for myself, but without the constraints of being essentially going deeper on the first book, but actually being able to just go deeper in terms of what are the real philosophical reasons, cultural reasons, scientific reasons as to why we've allowed ourselves to feel that we're separate from nature. I mean, it's quite bizarre. It's actually a form of insanity that has gripped us. And what does that mean? And how did that come about? And how can we then move beyond that? So there's a whole book, but I'll try and distill it now. And I have done a little podcast series as well to explain it in bite-sized chunks. But essentially, there are a whole multitude of reasons that have confluenced together, some of them quite early on. But we know at least that we've been around as Homo sapiens for at least 200,000 years ago, if not before. And of course, a lot of these theories about what went on back then are conjecture. We can only make that up from little fragments that we're finding, and all the time we're finding different fragments, which changes our view of our history. But suffice to say, that for a long period of time, up until about 10,000 years ago, so a long period of time from 200,000 to 10,000 years, it would seem that we lived in harmony with nature, that we were deeply attuned. The whole of humanity, of course, still shamanic and indigenous cultures are today, but so in tuned. For instance, today, or certainly a couple of generations ago, some of the sailors in the East Pacific Ocean, you could take them out, the indigenous people that live in those islands there, you could take them into a different part of the ocean, hundreds of miles away from where they were used to being, and place them, and they would know just from the sense of the winds and the currents that they could sense viscerally inside themselves where they were. And just as creatures knew when the tsunami was coming well before human beings did, because we had allowed ourselves to become out of tune, they were already fleeing. Some people had the sense to see the signs of nature and then follow. Nature still has that innate interconnectedness, and it's not just interconnections of points of this interacts with that from a kind of complexity theory perspective. It's a being, it's a sense of being that we sense within inside ourselves, and we have that capacity, a natural capacity within us. But we've allowed ourselves, through various reasons, a lot of it is to do with forms of oppression, through wanting to control ourselves and others. And some of it has come out for very good reason, like we moved away from being hunter-gatherers into becoming more agriculturalists and needing to plan and have a bit more of a sense of separation from nature and think about things ahead and learn from past, which takes us out of that presencing of the now. And to then rising patriarchy, for instance, and the Neolithic conquests in indigenous Europe, very much transforming the nature of communal activity into more one of domination through power and control, and that again changes an effect of our psyche, and all of these things have an effect, and they bubble up. I mean, in early ancient Greece, for instance, the foundation of Western civilization, around 500 BC, for instance, so 500 years before the birth of Christ, you had people like Pythagoras, who we now know today are as mathematicians or logicians, but actually in their day they were deeply shamanic. They were very much in tune with the rhythms of nature, and not just the rhythms of nature around us, but the rhythms of the stars, of the planets, of the music of the spheres. And what does this mean in terms of how we relate and how we tend towards harmony in our own relationships? The same with Lao Tzu in the Far East, Confucius, the Buddha, all around, actually, interestingly, around 500 years before Christ. And then, of course, Christ himself, Jesus of Nazareth, embodying this love of our experience of nature and of life. And yet, the general tendency has been towards one of separation, of power and control. Some people say part of that is due to rising patriarchy and the subjugation of the sexes, and seeing life through power struggles. Some argue that around the culmination of the scientific revolution after the Renaissance and around the 16th, 17th century, and the rise of rationalism, where we viewed everything as very logical through our left-brained hemispheres, that we became even more disconnected with life. And until that, there was still a mysticism, there was still an understanding of the interrelationality. Even in, for instance, medieval Christianity, there was this understanding of the immanence of God within nature, as well as the transcendence of God, that they were all aspects of the same divine. But that became very much undermined or suppressed as we got more and more in perhaps our left-brain hemispheres, and also hand in hand with an ego, a strengthening ego awareness, which sees more and more its own separation and sees the bits and bytes rather than the interconnectedness of life. And that's what I explore through that illusion of separation through the book, and how actually ancient philosophers, prophets, seers and shamans throughout the ages have long understood ways in which we can transcend that illusion. And that is becoming more and more vital for today. And we see that bubbling up in leadership, organizational development. We see that bubbling up in all sorts of areas these days. And I have great hope in the Gen X, Gen Ys and Gen Zs coming through, and actually innately seeing more of that and wanting to bring that into the ways in which we operate and organize.
And in what way do you see this new kind of change in leadership and in the corporate world?
Well, I mean, there's lots of movements these days happening that are bubbling up, that are really helping evolve or perhaps revolutionize capitalism into something else completely different. It's happening at the edges, the juicy edges. And what I would say, and what I say in my latest book, Future Fit, which is that for organizations to really survive and thrive in the volatile times ahead, to actually become future fit, then it's essential for us to start shifting our logic, our perceptual horizon away from just seeing the organization as a machine, seeing human resources as assets, and the supply chain to drive out profits and so forth, but to actually see the organization as a living system, and that living system is intimately interconnected with the living systems of society and our more than human world, that there is actually no fundamental separation, that we see it in nature, only semi-permeability and different levels of interrelationship. And when we start sensing into those interrelationships, which things like systems thinking have been doing more and more since the 80s, 90s. It's becoming more popular, certainly through Otto Scharmer's work and Peter Senge's work at MIT, and many of the other Frederic Laloux's work recently on reinventing organizations, all sorts of different areas now bubbling up. The B Corp movement, for instance, where organizations actually voluntarily change their constitution away from being beholden to short-term returns for shareholders to creating value for all stakeholders, including society and the environment. The rise of the purpose movement, seeing that our organizations are these living, purposeful systems, and that from purpose and recognizing people and planet, actually profit follows. And that's a major shift, actually. It's a revolution in consciousness that is manifesting in business just over the last 5 years, which in the grand scheme of things is not very much. I mean, I started talking about Firm of the Future back in 2010, but actually this thing has only really started gaining momentum in the last few years, and it's here to stay. This isn't something to be dispensed with in times of plenty, when the going gets tough, and only to be attained in times of plenty. This is core now. We're realizing the juicy edges of the future of business. We're realizing that this kind of mindset is core to how businesses need to be if they're going to be able to adapt and thrive in these volatile times.
So what do I do as a business leader if I completely resonate with everything you're saying and I read your book and I completely agree, and I want to start helping a change occur in my company? I may not be at sea level, but I want to inspire my colleagues and my bosses and my employees to start thinking differently about these things. Where's a good place to start for such a process?
Yes, I think there's lots of ways into this. So what I'm going to say here isn't in any way trying to be prescriptive, but I just offer this as part of the rich picture, if you like, because this is rich. This is essentially about transforming who we are and opening up to more of who we truly are as human beings, and allowing our organizations to actually become vessels for deeper purpose, for creating real value, from which healthy profit flows. And that's what true business was actually always about. And there's lots of evidence out there. This is essentially about good business sense, that organizations that embrace this kind of living systems approach consistently outperform their mechanistic counterparts. So this isn't about just being soft and fluffy. This is about opening up to how life really is and becoming wiser and becoming more effective as a result. So essentially part of this is a personal transformation and part of this is an organizational transformation. And I think both of those need to be held together. And so one of the things, so on Monday, I will be taking 10 leaders into nature from different organizations, a deep dive into nature, with some mindful activities and also sharing in groups. And one of the things we'll explore is this tension between inner and outer inside ourselves. How much are we focusing our attention on making change happen out there? And how much are we engaging with what's going on inside? So to use your language, this might be inner sustainability and outer sustainability, and realizing the relationship between them and how they both inform each other, and how the inner is really an important foundation from which the outer grows, the soil, if you like, from which the outer plant grows and gets its nutrients, and how important that is, and how we bring in practices or disciplines inside our own daily life to enhance that and to nurture that and give space, therefore, for that transformative process, because it can get messy, it can develop, it can change. And sometimes that can result in some people wishing to leave their current work, or wishing to have a different role, or to have some time out, or just to have time within the organization to share with others that are on that journey. One of the particular organizations I'm working with at the moment, a big ethical brand, we've been working with another partner organization that actually takes people into nature and holds them through a process of exploring their own personal purpose with an overnight time in nature, And then we bring groups back into the organization so they can then explore that, how they're getting on with their own personal journey, whilst also being aware of the organization as a vessel for holding them. So there's lots of ways into that. I suppose what I'm sharing with you now is the importance of inner and outer and personal sense of purpose, and how that personal journey is given space and time for within the organization and seen as really important for the livelihood and vitality of the organization.
I completely agree. I had an experience a few weeks ago where we're giving another presentation on some of my thoughts about what we need in terms of creating this transformation on a leadership level. I was also addressing the importance of this inner sustainability that I also address in my TED Talk. And one of them came up to me afterwards saying, well, I know that meditation and a strong connection to nature is nice, and I've heard the research behind it, etc. But I really, really don't think it belongs in a leadership context. It's not about leadership strategy. That's something you can do in your own personal space, but don't interfere it with leadership strategy and leadership development. What's your reflections around how we can navigate in that mindset? Because that's quite a normal mindset among many current leaders.
Yes. And even in some of the business schools I teach and advise at. So we need to meet people where they're at. That's our job as kind of bridge makers. And so fortunately, there's lots of scientific evidence that shows how just being in nature enhances our sense of meaningfulness, our well-being, our personal growth, our sense of purpose, as well as the kind of physiological improving mental well-being, cognitive functioning, creativity, and so forth. So that's one way to engage with people and say, well, look, there's that. The second way that I tend to do is by actually taking people into nature in small groups. A lot of the activity I do is very much about leadership first and foremost, and that nature is just being the vessel in which we are doing it. So people quite quickly get their own experiences of thinking, well, hang on a minute. That experience we had in nature, which could have been a day that we did in the office, was far richer and more profound than what would have happened in the office. And so I suppose meeting people where they're at and saying, well, what about an away day where we do it in a hotel and that we just use some of the grounds during that day? We don't have to take people straight into a wilderness quest for a week long with overnight solos. It's although I now work with some world leading organizations that are doing just that and realizing the importance of that. I'm with an organization next week that's actually developing these real deep dives in nature. So we're seeing now in this time of transformation. Let
us know what they gain from that. What's your experience? What do they gain from retreats like that and having that experience?
Oh, a huge amount. I mean, I remember when I was in business, I was, as I say, 300 or 400 emails a day, webinars, conference calls, meetings, often in rooms with no natural light, continuous pressure and targets and so forth. And so what we do in those deeper dives is we allow people to have the space and time to decompress, just to slow down and show them the importance of getting out of the head and connecting more with their somatic intelligence, with their heart awareness, and enhancing. I mean, now I think anyone who really understands about leadership knows about the importance of IQ, EQ, and SQ, and there's a lot of good work out there. So bringing those different intelligences together, and then as the week progresses, allowing people to really go deep and to really sense in and give themselves space to challenge some of the constrictions and personas and masks that we have developed to help us, inverted commas, survive in business, but actually that are undermining and getting in the way of our potential going forward. And if it was a group of people from the same organization, you can then do some really good work about, well, what does this mean in terms of some of the challenges we're experiencing in our own organization? If it's people from different organizations, then often you get people sharing and people go, wow, we're all dealing with similar challenges. I never forget once running a workshop with some senior executives from a German technical organization. And these were, they didn't want to be doing any of this. Everybody was suited and booted. And yet quite quickly you can get them into a very deep space. And I remember asking them all to just share their fears, to think about for a few moments in silence. What are the fears? What are they really fearful of? What's really going on for them? And then asking people to share, and of course people are very tentative, don't really want to share to start off with, but quite quickly then it all unfolds and people share, and the light bulb moment goes on when we realize, oh my gosh, we all have very similar fears. And just by sharing our fears, we can start seeing other people differently, more compassionately, when we realize that we're all struggling with the same things. And so if it's working in team dynamics, it can help shift how we see the dynamics in the team, how we see each other. And then there's work that you can do around constellations, around social presencing, and so forth, that actually unlock some of those tensions. But also just taking inspiration from nature about seeing your organization as a living system and looking at nature and taking some of that and bringing it into some of the challenges that you're experiencing can have a huge level of being able to shift framing and just allow people to sense into the future more effectively and to think things through in a far more creative and innovative way. So not only do you have a shift in purpose, a shift in a sort of psychological shift for people that enriches them and enlivens them, but you can also do some good work, in inverted commas, about how we improve the business in the process. So I think it's the stats are there to show how hugely beneficial it is, and a lot of the world leading leadership courses now have these kind of immersions in them. So I think the business case is pretty much sold. It's more about meeting people where they're at and being able to bring them on board in a way that makes them feel comfortable.
What do you think are the key leadership traits in the future if we are to embark on this massive transformation that we are? If we want to survive on this planet, what will be the key traits that are needed in leaders?
At the personal level, I would say about being able to embrace your own quality of presence through stillness, through being able to really sense what's going on for you in the evolving moment, especially in times of fast-moving change, noticing self-awareness, noticing when you're reacting from perhaps previous places and constrictions, and when you're actually opening up, presencing, to use Otto Scharmer and Peter Sengi's term, so that shift from absencing to presencing and being self-aware of that and being able to give yourself a discipline that enhances that self-awareness and enhances your self-mastery so that you can develop flow in times of fast-moving change. I think that's very important from a personal perspective. From a kind of relational perspective, being able to work with teams, I think there's something about embracing not knowing. Being able to go into the space of not knowing. So shifting from that leader as hero, leader as in charge, as knowing, and being able to embrace not knowing and being able to open up to the social intelligence of the group, but being able to help the group being confident enough and trusting in you enough to hold space that they can go into not knowing. Because so much of our time is about, we've got to know things. We don't want to fail. But actually we know that all the great innovations and all of the real things that help us become future fit and adapt in these times of fast moving change come from not knowing, come from letting go of previous frames and really opening up to this emerging future. And so leaders that are able to hold those spaces whilst being coherent in themselves and providing coherence in others and allowing others to go on that personal journey, organizational journey in a way that is held and makes people feel safe is really important going forward.
I couldn't agree more. My only concern is that, or maybe I have many others in terms of how we can help this shift and transformation happen as soon as possible, is that I have a hard time seeing many of the CEOs that I've come across in my lifetime of working in the field of sustainability and business are not comfortable with uncertainty. Actually, they hate that kind of vulnerability, in a sense, that you need to show as a leader when you embrace uncertainty and exclaim that you don't have the answers, and let's co-create these answers together. How can we best help create a culture where vulnerability is okay, uncertainty is okay? What can we best do, you and I? Because I think it needs to happen from a bottom-up level. I'm not comfortable or certain that it will come from the C-level suite, this transformation. So what can we do as parents, as school teachers, as civil sergeants in a way?
Well, I would say that each of us, we're all unique tunes in a way, whilst we're immersed in this connectedness of life and we're all engaging in this deeper interbeing. We are all unique tunes, and we all have to find that uniqueness in our way of showing up in the world. So there are certain practices and time-honored approaches that can help us. But I think it's up to us to each find our own ways. And I think something about perhaps connecting with like-minded people, kindred spirits, joining up and sharing, just as you and I have done here, for instance, and sharing our stories with others is all part of this massive unfolding that we're seeing, this breakdown and breakthrough, which on the one hand, the breakdown has to happen in order for the breakthrough to start forming, just as we see in any metamorphic process. The breakdown is essential for the breakthrough to really start happening. On the other hand, it's that breakdown that can cause all sorts of problems, fear, anxiety, and a desire to actually hold on to the tried and tested. But evolution has its way. It's relentless. It'll happen. It's unfolding anyway. So it's more about how do we allow this evolution through this time of breakdown and breakthrough to be less painful for ourselves by creating space for others to come through. And so some of the honourable things for CEOs to do is perhaps say, look, it's time for me to step aside and let other people through, or I will become a coach instead. And I agree with you. A lot of this is bottom up. So how do we encourage I'm working with an organization at the moment where we're encouraging a coaching culture within the all levels of the organization, so people can just spend time getting comfortable with mentoring and sharing with each other and realizing that we're all learning, and that it's okay to fail and to learn from that and to sense into what are our own learning objectives and development objectives. And what we're seeing now is this massive change in leadership development and cultural development, where it's not about, a top-down, one-size-fits-all, or this is for high potentials and this is for the rest, or whatever. That actually we're now developing our own styles of learning and development, and then sharing that in peer-to-peer learning, which is helping create and unlock that desire to be more human at some of the more junior levels in the organization. And that can work really well when hand in hand with some of the technical breakthrough innovations around social media, sharing, Google X hubs and so forth, co-creative platforms, where you get this really exciting feeling of people being involved in actually prototyping the future whilst learning and failing as they go.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Giles. I have one final question before we finish our conversation, and I am now interviewing a bunch of thought leaders that are all each in their own way representing this change of paradigm that we are embarking on as a collective. And part of that is also to co-create sort of like a manifest for the future generation of leaders. And I would like your input into what would be your 2 key necessities that has to be in such a manifest for transformational leadership.
I think one key necessity is embracing a shift in consciousness from separateness to connectedness. because I see that as so foundational to how we view ourselves as leaders and how we view our organizations as living systems. So I think that's one. I'd say another is embracing this not knowing, and hand in hand with our own self-awareness stroke system awareness, where we can sense into a social field, where we are sensing into an emerging field of possibilities, going into a not knowing, a vulnerability state, if you want, a letting go phase, where in that openness, that vulnerability, we actually sense into something far deeper, beyond ourselves, even perhaps beyond the social intelligence of that team, into a kind of implicate order of nature, if you like, where we help co-create, we co-manifest with life. And I think that is an awesome responsibility, and is very much what we give as human beings, as Homo sapiens, wise beings. So those would be my two. One, a shift in consciousness, and two, this sort of shift in letting go and really opening up to our emerging future.
Beautiful. I really love those two inputs. And Giles, thank you so much for being one of the, thankfully, many cracks of light in the world right now.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Laura, for your time.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Cracks of Light podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help me make the cracks of light bigger and brighter in this world by sharing this with your network. Together, we can build a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. And if you have input to the Cracks of Light Leadership Manifesto, please go to my website, www.laura-storm.com. I would love to hear from you. Take care.